Hello friends, my name is JJ. So the other day I was in Japan, and while I was there, I learned all about this really cool thing that the Japanese are waist deep in at the moment, Showa nostalgia. Basically, Showa nostalgia means nostalgia for cultural stuff from the mid to late 20th century, including movies, music, fashion, snacks, interior design, you name it. Like, check this out. I bought this little book about Showa junk food, thinking I had found something special, but then I learned that it is actually part of an extremely extensive series of books about all manner of Showa nostalgic things, including Showa board games, Showa sodas, Showa apartment buildings, Showa audio equipment, and Showa pachinko machines. This kind of stuff is absolutely everywhere in Japan these days. In an earlier video, I talked about how these little toy reproductions of household objects from the 20th century are really big right now. And the other day, a Japanese friend sent me this Instagram reel hyping a Showa nostalgia-themed restaurant in Fukuoka, where you can buy old-fashioned treats and play retro video games.
住吉にある昭和レトロな空間で駄菓子とゲームが楽しめる。
The reason I find Showa nostalgia so interesting is because it is obviously not something that is limited to Japan. This continent is obviously equally deep in a similar sort of 20th century cultural nostalgia, manifest in everything from our perennial obsession with classic rock to a revived interest in mid-century furniture to throwback Jersey night at the old sports ball game to imaginative new forms of nostalgic art like vaporwave music. Now, I don't want to debate the pros and cons of nostalgia today. I am personally pretty pro, but we can discuss that some other time. No, what I want to talk about is the fact that the Japanese specifically call this whole phenomenon Showa nostalgia, which is a more interesting topic than it might seem. Because you see, in Japanese culture, the Showa era has a specific beginning and end, and as a result, the Japanese have a very clear sense of exactly what decades of their recent history they should regard as being firmly in the past versus when the era they are in now formally began. And I think this is something we have never really fully sorted out in our own culture, by contrast. It might be time to try. So, Showa, as an adjective, officially refers to the years that Japan's beloved war criminal emperor Hirohito the Peaceful was on the throne, a reign which began with the death of his father in 1926 and ended with his own death in 1989. The literal translation of Showa is something like shining age of peace. All Japanese emperors get an adjectival phrase of the government's choosing assigned to their reign years when they assume the throne. That said, these days the Japanese tend to gloss over the early Showa years, which were obviously dominated by the rise of Japanese fascism and the horrors of World War II, which Japan and Emperor Hirohito himself were deeply complicit in. In a colloquial, cultural sense, Japanese people now mostly use Showa to refer to a specific 45-year period after 1945. None of these Showa books talk about pre-war stuff, for instance. Hirohito was the last Japanese emperor to be truly venerated, both literally and in a broader institutionalized sense. Japan changed a lot in the decades after the war, and by the end of his life, it was clear the country had become a considerably less reverential and monarchist society. Accordingly, after he died, following a period of really hideous illness where he was constantly vomiting and defecating blood, which the now free Japanese press documented in gratuitous detail, some older traditions associated with the monarchy were quietly phased out. A big one was the custom of writing dates relative to the emperor's reign year. Under Hirohito, this was done all of the time in every conceivable context. Movie posters would announce release dates and what year of the Showa reign they were coming out. Magazines would number their issues in Showa years. TV show end credits would note what Showa year they were copyrighted, and so on. Today, in some very formal situations, you still see the Japanese record dates using the emperor method, but by and large it has been phased out of daily life in favor of writing dates in the Western style, which means one big trigger of Showa nostalgia is simply seeing a thing using the Showa dating system. Now, from a timeline perspective, Hirohito died at a very convenient moment, the first week of January 1989. This meant that the Showa era ended in nearly perfect sync with the conclusion of the 1980s, which had been a very culturally dynamic and vibrant decade for Japan, as it had been for much of the developed world. And this is what I mean when I say that I think the concept of the Showa era is broadly relatable and useful for countries outside of Japan as well. As they were in Japan, the 4 decades between 1945 and 1989 were a time of tremendous economic growth in the West as well, heralding the rise of an enormous middle class alongside advancements in household technology, including what the Japanese called the 3 sacred treasures, the emergence of all sorts of new genres of entertainment, and the widespread revision of long-standing social norms. The years between 1945 and 1989, not incidentally, also produced many of the people roaming the earth today, including all members of the Boomer and Gen X generations, and at least half of the millennials. And this is why I believe that when we think about the modern world and everything that defines it, we really need to think about this era in particular as playing an inescapably significant role. The world that came before it was largely unrecognizable, and the world that's come after has not yet proven itself nearly as consequential. The other thing that I really like about the concept of the Showa age is how much conceptual similarity it has to another pivotal period of human history that is also commonly linked to the reign of a famous monarch. I speak, of course, of the Victorian age. Victoria the Good was Queen of Great Britain from 1837 to 1901, which were also decades that saw tremendous growth in much of the developed world's middle class, the emergence of new life-changing technologies, the invention of new genres of entertainment, and the revision of long-standing social norms. Specifically, we tend to associate the Victorian age with things like the rise of factories and trains, a dramatic expansion of global trade, the founding of large corporations, and the hardening of a lot of attitudes about sex and gender that wouldn't be undone until the late 20th century. Again, it's very difficult to appreciate anything about the world we live in today without acknowledging the degree that so many key components of it were specifically constructed during Victorian times. Longtime viewers will know that I'm quite fond of citing the late 19th century and mid to late 20th century as the 2 most culturally important eras in all of human history. Now, all of that said, the obvious problems with using the terms Victorian and Showa to describe these 2 very consequential periods of cultural development is that their beginning and end dates are deeply arbitrary. Because I mean, they're fundamentally just based on the adult lifespans of 2 random people. Their reigns occurred in convenient sync with the start and ends of 2 important cultural eras, but not perfectly. And you see this in the way that it has become common to fudge the precise dates in which these 2 eras began in order to make them more anthropologically useful. People don't usually think of the most earliest years of Queen Victoria's reign as being the real Victorian age, for instance, just given that a lot of the most stereotypically Victorian stuff didn't happen until much later. Much of the technology that defined the Victorian age required enormous amounts of steel, for instance, and this wasn't possible until the 1850s and 60s when new procedures for mass producing steel were invented. And this in turn is what kicked off the Industrial Revolution, or at least one phase of it. The Industrial Revolution is another thing that's kind of hard to precisely define. This book that I bought the other day, The Victorian Country Child, starts its chronology in 1850, which I feel is a pretty common informal start date for the Victorian period. This very good book, Slouching Towards Utopia, starts even later, saying that none of the important stuff in the 19th century happened until 1870. Likewise, as we discussed earlier, despite the fact that Emperor Hirohito came to the throne in 1926, the decades before and during World War II aren't really considered representative of Showa culture in the modern colloquial sense. And this is not just because the Japanese are ashamed of what they did in that period either. Many of the massive cultural changes that followed the war were only possible because of the war itself, not the least of which being all of the new technology that was developed to help win it. Queen Victoria died in January of 1901, which was convenient in that it made the literal Victorian age end pretty neatly in sync with the dawn of the 20th century. But on the other hand, a lot of people would say that the true death of Victorian culture, and particularly the Victorian mindset, didn't really come until 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. And that war in turn can be seen as the beginning of 3 chaotic decades of global violence and economic disaster that wouldn't end until the conclusion of World War II in 1945. I've mentioned before that I'm quite fond of the historian Matthew White's term for this particular era, the hemoclysm or blood wave, which he says future generations will likely understand as a single contiguous period of unprecedented global death and destruction. But that just brings us back to the Showa age. And if we agree that the proper Showa age of late 20th century innovation and prosperity should start in 1945, when should it end? In the Japanese context, most people would probably say that 1992 is a better end date than 1989, just in the sense that 92 was the year that the Japanese economy entered a severe economic recession that more or less permanently put an end to its decades of steady post-war economic growth. But if we think of the Showa years as something more akin to the Victorian age, in the sense of a cultural period that explains a global rather than national phenomenon, I think a lot of people would say that that age should end earlier. The French economist Jean Fourastier wrote an influential book on post-war France in which he used the term les Trente Glorieux, or Magnificent 30, to describe the uniquely prosperous and innovative post-war decades of French history. As you can tell from the name, he thought that this era only lasted for about 30 years, and he pegged the end date as 1973. 1973 was the year that saw the start of a pretty severe 16-month economic recession in much of the Western world, provoked by the OPEC oil embargo, amongst other things. It is often understood as the moment in which the post-war economy shifted in some profound and permanent ways, with record high inflation in particular marking the end of the era of 15-cent hamburgers and $30 suits and all of that. Culturally, however, I think it is easy to argue that things didn't slow down all that much, and that the developed world continued to be reshaped by major innovations for the remainder of the 1970s, including the debut of cable television, the invention of hip-hop, Hollywood's auteur era, and the first video game. I feel the same way about the concept of mid-century, which is probably the closest thing we have in English to a name for a specific period of the post-war age with an implied endpoint. It's a term that's often used as much as an aesthetic description as anything. You know, mid-century interior design and mid-century fashion and mid-century advertising and all of that. It all refers to a kind of distinctive minimalistic style that was briefly in vogue right after the war. The problem is just that, as the name implies, mid-century kind of limits its ambitions to only describing the exact middle of the 20th century and nothing else. The 50s and 60s, and that's it. And maybe not even the entirety of the 60s. So talking about the mid-century era is maybe useful in describing the very specific cultural tastes of the immediate post-war years, especially prior to some of the more radical cultural movements of the 1960s. But the term also somewhat arbitrarily ignores the degree that a lot of the cultural trends of the 50s and 60s continued beyond the middle of the century and into the 70s and even early 80s in a way that is often not easy to distinguish. Like, you look at a bunch of random consumer goods, and I don't know if it's necessarily obvious which ones were from the 50s or 70s or what. The super stereotypical mid-century modern aesthetic that has become synonymous with the term has likewise always struck me as a bit of an exclusively elitist thing. Like, my grandmother barely redecorated her apartment since the 1960s, and I can assure you it didn't look like this. One thing the years 1945 to 1989 do have going for them is that they happen to encapsulate most of the Cold War, or at least the existence of communism in Eastern Europe. You can see this book I got on Soviet design spans the years from 1950 to 1989, which from the Russian perspective is basically the entire of post-war communist culture. I wouldn't say that the Cold War functions as a comparable cultural era here in the West, given that, you know, we won it and thus didn't have to change our entire socioeconomic system when it ended. But it did ostensibly provide at least some guiding mission to our society that had at least some influence on the sort of culture and technology we produced, and that can't be fully ignored. So I'm instead inclined to agree with the Showa system of having the magnificent post-war years end in the 80s, though my pick for the cutoff date would be the pivotal year of 1984. And not just because that's the year that I was born. 1984 is often recognized as the year that the personal computer became a mainstream thing. It was the year that Apple released their Macintosh version 1, the first computer to use the mouse and clicking-based interface that we all know and love today.
Of course, to do all this, you will have to learn to do this.
As well as the year that IBM released its second-generation PC, the 5170, proving that they were serious about the PC market as well. 1984 was also the first year that CDs capable of storing computer data were first unveiled by all of the big electronics companies. This was a major revolution in how computers worked because it allowed for the possibility of software programs that were literally 1,000 times larger than the ones that could be stored on these things. So while computers obviously existed before 1984, I think it is fair to identify 1984 as the start of the era in which they became the dominant technological presence in our lives, or at the very least, the end of the era in which they played little to no role. In the same way that we recognize the period between the two world wars as being fairly culturally stagnant, I think that you could argue that the 80s, 90s, and maybe even the early 2000s were a similar sort of in-between transitionary period leading into whatever computer and internet-dominated age we live in now, with this age maybe not even having properly begun until smartphones were invented or something. But anyway, you can probably guess where this is going. What year do you think we should recognize as marking the end of the true Showa age of post-war, late 20th century innovation and modernity? Do you believe we're in a distinct cultural age right now? When did it start, and what should we call it? All good questions to be answered in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and tell all your buddies, and I will see you next week.